In my thousands of hours playing this game and hundreds of builds made later, I may have finally discovered the single most easiest build to use that requires no skill and has lots of success. With this build right here, I beat bosses like Godfrey, Radagon, Godskin Duo, Mesmer, Rolana, Promised Consort Radahn, Gaius. I beat all these bosses with not only complete ease, but I also beat them without dodging and without even using my healing flask. And you're pretty much seeing it in the gameplay right now. This exact build literally makes almost every single boss and enemy in this game just a complete and utter joke. Now, I did say most. There are like some select bosses out there, and there are some circumstances where it doesn't really work as easily as this, especially once you do get to later New Game Plus iterations. But I will talk about that in a bit, because I just want to really break down exactly what is going on. Now, obviously, this is a tank build, to which, as you see, I am not taking much damage at all. I have a bunch of defense buffs stacked up together, and it's making it to where I can easily trade out with bosses. I'm stats breaking them really quickly, and I'm also getting my health back too, while not even using the Flask of Crimson Tears. Now, how exactly did we accomplish this? There are many things that you can do to help with survivability. Obviously, the major one being Vigor. We have 60 Vigor right now. And I was also using the Morgoth's Great Rune, which this Great Rune increases your maximum HP by 25%. I normally don't talk about Great Runes when it comes to my builds, but in terms of min-maxing defenses, you kind of have to. I did also test out things like Millennia's Great Rune and Radahn's Great Rune, but I found that Morgoth's Great Rune just gave me the most success. Now, I do also have 35 Endurance and 53 Strength, because yes, we are going to go into a Strength-based build and use the Parta. Now, if you guys don't know, leveling up your Strength also does improve your physical damage negation, so actually can take a bit more damage with more Strength, and with a tank-based build, it just makes more sense. And I do have 35 Endurance because obviously I plan to use the heaviest armor in the game with the best defenses, which in this instance is the Verdigris armor, which unfortunately, yes, you do get it all the way in the DLC alongside our weapon of choice, but there are going to be some base game alternatives. The weapon alternative is the Kata, and obviously for the armor set, literally anything that's heavy, the Lionel armor set, the Bull Goat set, as long as you're not overloaded, then you're going to be perfectly okay, because yes, as you do notice, we are heavy loaded right now. We are fat rolling, but with our build, we don't really even plan to dodge, but we obviously don't want to be overloaded because you still want to be able to sprint and sometimes dodge, because although the heavy roll does look very clunky, doesn't dodge very far, and have longer recovery frames, the actual iframes that you get with a heavy roll is almost just as much as a medium roll, so it's still very manageable. But in terms of the talismans, we do have the Dragon Crest Great Shield talisman, which is just more physical damage negation. We have the Verdigris Discus, which if you do have a heavy load or overload, you'll gain a bit of a damage negation boost. And probably the most important talisman for this build is going to be the Assassin's Crimson Dagger. Because as you may have been noticing with the gameplay, we are getting stance breaks really quickly, and we're getting lots of opportunities to get a critical attack. And with a critical attack, we get over 10% of our health back while just having this talisman equipped. And one other thing you may have noticed is that when you do get a critical attack with a dagger, against most bosses, it ends up hitting twice. And therefore, it actually procs this talisman buff twice and healing us for over 20% of our health. So that means we're getting over 400 HP back for every single critical attack, which is just insane. And as for your last talisman slots, you can go multiple different ways. I have the Blade of Mercy, which this talisman does result in 20% more damage 20 seconds after getting a critical attack. And as I mentioned with the dagger critical attack, being that it hits twice, it actually procs the buff the first time, and then the second hit of the critical attack, where most of the damage comes from, is actually also boosted by this. So it can literally be just a much better version of the dagger talisman. Now, some other alternative talismans that you can use, obviously you can use the dagger talisman if you haven't been to the DLC yet. If you wanted some more survivability, you can use the Crimson Sea talisman, which this is easily one of the best talismans in the entire game. It's like having a plus 16 flask. And you can also go with the Old Lord's talisman as well, because with this build, we are going to be using a handful of buffs, and the Old Lord's talisman does actually extend the duration of these buffs by 30%. And one strategy you actually can use is right before a boss fight, you can have this talisman equipped, use all of your buffs, and then switch off the talisman before you get into the boss room, and you'll still benefit of that 30% extended duration. Now, when it comes to the buffs that we are using, it might seem like we're using thousands of different buffs just to be able to gain this damage negation, but it's not really that complicated. One thing you may have noticed with my build is that I haven't really spec'd into much of my damaging stats, but I do have a handful of faith, exactly 26, and that is because we want to be able to use things like Golden Vow and Blessing's Boon. Blessing's Boon is some nice health regen, and Golden Vow is 15% damage and 10% damage negation, and it's an aura buff. Therefore, it can stack with body buffs like Black Flame Protection or the fortification-based spells, but the body buff that we're going to use is the Boiled Crab. You can buy an infinite amount of these off BRAGGARTS for very cheap, and this is going to give you 20% physical damage negation. And in our crystal tier, obviously we are going to go with the opaline hard tier, which is 15% more damage negation across the board. And for the second crystal tier slot, you can go multiple different ways. Being that this build is like very spam heavy, you can very well use things like the green burst talisman, which is just a bunch more stamina recovery speed. You can also go with the crimson bubble tier, which gives you a bunch of health back once you do reach lower HP. But you can also use the flame shrouding cracked tier, which is going to give you 20% more fire damage. And the reason for that is because after we do get a stance break, we're going to switch to our fire infused misericord and just get a bunch of damage off, which is where most of our damage is going to be coming from. Now, the reason why we do go with a fire infused misericord is because obviously we do have a strength based build, and the fire infusion gives you a strength based scaling, but also that split damage completely bypasses critical attacks. So typically, even though you get higher AR with a fire infusion, the heavy infusion might end up just getting you more damage because it's pure physical damage, and you don't have to go through two defenses. But that same concept doesn't actually apply to critical attacks. So you can actually just maximize your damage output just by having an elemental infused weapon. Now, obviously, once you do go up against enemies that are really resist to fire damage, like Moog, I recommend switching off that. But outside of those bosses, it is going to be best left with a fire infusion. But as for the remaining buffs and the weapons that we are going to be going with, we have Braggart's Raw and we have Endure infused onto the Parter. And we actually, in fact, have two Parter. Now, you might be wondering why we actually have two of the exact same weapon that we can very well just two-hand and gain the power stancing combo. And that is because we want to benefit off the Braggart's Roar buff. If you don't know, this buff itself not only changes up the heavy attack of that weapon, but it also gives you a bunch of stamina recovery speed and 10% damage negation. But you have to have the weapon equipped. And in most cases, if you're going to be going with a power stancing build, your offhand weapon, or the one in your left hand, you're not going to really be using the skill of much. So you're better off just having that one be a buff, and Braggart's Roar just being the best one for those reasons I mentioned. And in our main hands, we're going to have a heavy infused Parter with Endure. Now, the question is, why the Parter? Why are we going with this weapon? And that is because with this build, we want to be able to stance break really quickly, because stance breaking quickly means that we're interrupting the enemy, so we're taking less damage. And with the power of the misericord critical attack, with the Assassin's Crimson Dagger, we are getting so much damage and so much health regen back. And being that we have to power stance because we want to benefit off the Braggart's Roar buff in the offhand, we want to be able to pick the best stance breaking weapon that can be used with one hand, which the Parter or just fist weapons in general kind of do that job. Because the best part about fist weapons is going to be their stance damage. Things like the Star Fist are one of the best weapons in the entire game because their heavy attacks are so incredibly fast and output 33 stance damage when you have them two-handed. And the thing is, the one-handed fist weapon attack is not even that much worse. Yes, it's not going to get as much damage as like the two-handed attack, but it actually does 30 stance damage. Now, typically the Parter heavy attack, when you have it two-handed, is a 1-2 punch, and for whatever reason, the two-handed combo only does 15 stance damage. So yeah, if you have it one-handed, it does twice as much stance damage. But the reason why I'm going to value a one-handed Parter compared to things like a one-handed Star Fist is for multiple reasons. One is obviously going to be the range. This thing has straight sword types of range, and we want to be able to stance break really consistently. Also, the Parter does get piercing damage, which is the best damage type in the entire game, and mainly because of things like counter damage. If you hit an enemy throughout an attack combo with piercing damage, they're going to take bonus damage. And with a tank-based build, we're basically trading blows, so the Parter can very easily outdamage the Star Fist with a one-handed charged heavy attack. And if you actually wanted to get a critical attack with the Parter, it would be better too because it gets 110 crit. Now, in this case, we are just going to be switching back to the misericord every single time because the misericord gets 140 crit, which is just ridiculous. And it is going to benefit off that 2 hits, so it's going to help better pair with those talismans that we mentioned earlier. And the reason why we do have a Parter in the offhand is because we can still very well benefit off the power stancing combo, but also benefit of having that two-handed heavy attack and the Braggart's Roar buff active at the same time. Now, this is not completely necessary. For most bosses, you're just going to be spamming the heavy attack, but if you did end up fighting bosses that can't be hit with a critical attack, there isn't going to be that much more of a benefit to stance break, and in that instance, you probably want to end up using just the regular light attack combos, especially against like smaller trash mobs. Now, unfortunately, you can only get one Parter per playthrough, so for your first like 1.5 playthroughs, you probably have to have like another fist weapon in your offhand, probably like the Kata is a decent alternative. But the most important part about the build is the Endure skill, because Endure is easily one of the best Ashes of War in the entire game. I think it's top 10. I know in my Ashes of War video, I kind of put it a bit lower than that, and I definitely do regret that decision. It is 100% a top 10 Ashes of War in this game, especially paired alongside quicker types weapons like fists, because it is actually actually a really fast buffing animation, and if you don't know what Endure does, for 9 FP and for 3 seconds, it does give you 50% damage negation across the board and a whole bunch of hardness, meaning that you're not only going to be taking a whole bunch less damage, but you're also not going to be staggered at all, which is probably why you see myself not just getting staggered over the most insane, hard-hitting AoE attacks in the game. Like, I can tank things like Radagon's slamming attack, the Placidusax's nuke, even Radahn's big giant meteor attack. I can just tank the entire thing. So basically how the build actually works is that when you're about to get hit, you just click Endure, and then spam heavy attack for the next couple of seconds, click Endure again, and then rinse and repeat until you get a stance break, then switch to the misrecord, get the high damaging critical attack, reset your health back to full, and then keep going that way. Now, unfortunately, there are going to be some major downsides and drawbacks to this build. One is going to be against larger bosses, not going to be the best thing to try and use and try and tanking attacks, especially the ones that are faster. Enemies like Bale doesn't really do that well. But we have 26 faith, and with 26 faith and lots of strength, we can use things like the Claw Mark Seal, slap on stuff like Pest Threads or Pest Thread Spears, and every single one of these larger bosses is just going to be made toast. But one thing that we do have infused onto our misrecord is Flame of the Redmanes. This is an AoE based skill that does scale off strength, and it can serve as a projectile as well. It goes pretty far, nice horizontal spread, can do some nice damage, and it can clean out a bunch of trash mobs really quickly. So this build pretty much covers every weakness that there really is, except for one, and that is at later New Game Plus iterations. Specifically like at New Game Plus 5, 6, and 7, enemies have really large amounts of poise, and it takes a lot more heavy attacks to be able to stance break, and enemies are doing a lot more damage. So although the build will work perfectly fine, it's not going to work anywhere near as well. But in that instance, you could actually use some other types of buffs or debuffs to help it be a bit more in line. And I haven't really talked about these buffs yet, but things like Holy Ground slapped onto a shield. This Asher War just creates like a little holy AoE, which standing inside of it does give you a whole bunch of health regen and 20% damage negation. Also, if you are like in later New Game Plus iterations, you have really high levels. Therefore, you have a lot more spells available to you. Stuff like Grail's Roar is pretty much going to be a must-have because it makes enemies take way less damage and make them do less damage as well. And you can also just use some frost-based spells as well. Things like Zamor Ice Storm, which pairs perfectly alongside Endure, or just regular Chilling Mist or Freezing Mist. These things are going to proc frost really quickly, and frost debuffs enemies to make them just take more damage. Now, unfortunately, if you do use like a Fire Misericord, it is going to remove the frost debuff, but at higher levels, you probably should go into like a different elemental infusion anyway. So there are ways to try and make the build a bit better once you do get to these higher levels, but 100% and without a doubt, this is probably the best build to use, and one of the easiest build to use against most enemies and bosses in regular New Game, and probably the next couple of New Games as well. Anyway, that is basically us done. This was like a longer video just talking about one specific build, but there was lots of things to touch on. So just let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. And yeah, I'll catch you guys around. See ya.